Does this man look happy to you? He should. This is a photo of J.P. Bickle in the summer of 1938. He's a fascinating character who often gets overlooked in the Leafs narrative because of the oversized personality of Conn Smythe. But if it wasn't for Bickle, we may have never even heard of Smythe in the first place. Though he came from humble roots, JP made his fortune in the financial world by the time he was in his 30s. In 1924, he invested in the Toronto St. Patricks to help bail them out financially as a favor to a friend who owned the team. And it was Bickle, as you remember from episode 1, who helped facilitate the sale of the St. Pats to Smythe. From 1924 until his death in 1951, J.P. Bickle served as owner, president, chairman, and director of Toronto's only NHL franchise. That would make anybody happy. The Leafs' 1938-39 season started on November 3rd. Their fourth game was on November the 12th, the day this magazine article was published. Entitled Canada's Saturday Night Kids, it described the team's national broadcast coverage and introduces some of the players returning to the club: Kelly, Metz, Parsons, Fowler, Broda, and Red Horner, the team's new captain. Their 13th game was less than a month later, on December 10th. Notice how the same publication now uses the words guns and war in their coverage. This certainly reflected the times, as Europe seemed headed towards confrontation. And it also foreshadowed the Leafs' own involvement in that conflict. Remember that first newspaper piece, Canada's Saturday Night Kids, about the returning players? It also mentions one hopeful, a guy named Jack Howard, who, quote, didn't make the NHL grade. But 7 new skaters did make the roster, 4 of them rookies: Jack Church, Toronto-born Red Heron, Pete Langell, and Don Metz, brother of Nick. The 3 veteran newcomers were Wilfred Bucko McDonald, who the Leafs first looked at in 1933, Gus Marker, and Doc Romness. Elwyn Doc Romness only played that one season in Toronto, becoming the 4th American-born player to skate for the Blue and White after Carl Voss, Roger Jenkins, and Alex Levinsky. Conn's Maple Leafs played on both Christmas Eve and Boxing Day in December of 1938. When he wasn't on the ice, Gus Marker was making Christmas cards featuring him in his new Toronto uniform. Though new to the team, the right winger began his pro career in 1932 with the Red Wings, then played 4 seasons for the Maroons before joining the Maple Leafs. The team also played on New Year's Eve as well as on New Year's Day. It was now 1939, and in 8 months there would be war in Europe. Back home, Toronto's regular season plodded along, and they finished 3rd in a 7-team NHL. They were led in scoring by Apps, Drillin, and perennial party machine Busher Jackson. The Leafs playoffs started against the New York Americans in the quarterfinals. Here are forwards Armstrong and Davidson during Game 2 of that best-of-3 series, which the Blue and White swept thanks to Gord Drillin's 2 goals in the second game. There's Gus Marker in the middle. Perhaps Gus is signing a late Christmas card for Gord. Next up were the Red Wings in the semifinals, which Toronto took 2-1. Here are Davidson, Campman, and Broda in a fine mood during that series against Detroit, with Gus Marker in the background. You know, for a new guy, that Marker sure made it into a lot of photos. So here they were, at the end of the decade, back in the finals for the 5th time in 7 years since winning their only championship. Their opponents would be a Boston Bruins club still featuring Dick Clapper and Eddie Shore, the man who almost killed Ace Bailey, along with former Leafs Flash Hollett and Charlie Sands, and a player named Gord Pettinger, brother of Eric Pettinger, who was one of the players that Conn Smythe traded for King Clancy in order to win that single Stanley Cup. Boston finished first in the NHL regular season, 27 points ahead of Toronto, and it certainly showed, as the Leafs could only win Game 2 of their best-of-7 series. Here's a photo from that lone victory. 1 week later, the playoffs were over for the Toronto Maple Leafs. Officially, our series ends here at the conclusion of the 1938-39 season. So it's as good a time as any to reflect on what came before and what followed after. Conn Smythe, along with the likes of J.P. Bickle and Frank Selke and countless others, was responsible for developing not only a hockey team, but the blueprint for much of what we experience in the modern game. For example, from a media point of view, specifically building the gondola to facilitate radio network coverage of the Leafs increased broadcast audiences from 100,000 in 1931 to almost 3 million by 1934, with a little help from Foster Hewitt. Those legions of listeners attracted high-profile advertisers and sponsors, first from General Motors and then from Imperial Oil in 1936. After which an intermission show was added to keep people listening between periods. It was called the Hot Stove League and featured host Wes McKnight, leading a discussion of NHL events with hockey insiders, a format used widely today. The segment became as popular as Hewitt's play-by-play and evolved into Hockey Night in Canada, which most living Canadians have never lived without. In the spring and summer of 1939, King George and Queen Elizabeth toured Canada on a royal visit to whip up nationalism in preparation for the coming war in Europe. Here's a photo of them during their stop in Toronto. When September arrived and hostilities began, Smythe returned to his commission in the army and involved the Leafs top to bottom in the war effort. If you want a cheap analogy, then the aggression that Drillin, Chamberlain, and Heron exhibit in this Christmas Day 1939 game against the Rangers is the same fighting spirit that Smythe demanded from the men he recruited. There's Conn on the right in the battlefields of France. He was the commanding officer of the 30th Light Anti-Aircraft Battery of the 7th Toronto Regiment, better known as the Sportsman's Battery, because it was filled with top Canadian hockey, lacrosse, baseball, football, and golf stars, as well as a few sports writers. The unit became part of the Royal Canadian Artillery in 1941, went to England the following year, and was landed in Normandy about a month after D-Day. Roughly 2 weeks after that, the Sportsman's Battery was attacked by Germany's Luftwaffe. Conn barely survived his wounds and would walk with a limp until the day he died in 1980. Wartime also meant that Foster Hewitt changed his standard intro, welcoming listeners in Canada, the United States, and Newfoundland to include Canadian servicemen overseas. And while Smythe was focused on the fighting across the Atlantic, he left Frank Selke in charge of running the Maple Leafs. J.P. Bickle, meanwhile, lent his financial and business expertise to help the Canadian government's war effort. But even though Smythe, Selke, and Bickle were occupied with different tasks, they were all acutely aware of one thing: optics. You see, owners and operators of professional sports teams possess valuable commodities during wartime: healthy young male bodies. During the First World War, Canadian and American sports leagues started playing national anthems at games to boost patriotism amongst the general public. In exchange, governments held back from mass drafts of players and didn't break up the team owners' lucrative labor monopolies. Knowing this history, Smythe would enlist players like Silaps and Turk Broda into the Canadian Army and stack his Second World War rosters with men who had medical deferments and could not be soldiers. Here's one of the Leafs lineups, published by the Gardens. Every player's reason for not being enlisted is printed below their name. However, as much as Smythe was aware of how patriotic his team should appear, none of it was fake. Remember, Conn was a First World War veteran in both the Air Force and artillery, where his unit was also called the Sportsman's Battery. He was awarded the Military Cross twice and was a German POW for more than a year. Major Conn Smythe was such a military man that he named his hockey club after the Canadian Army's maple leaf emblem. Between 1927 and 1939, Toronto's NHL franchise went from for sale to formidable. The NHL named Turk Broda, King Clancy, and Charlie Conacher amongst its greatest 100 players of all times, along with Silaps. In all, 15 Hockey Hall of Famers skated for the Blue and White during that golden era, some with bigger names: Apps, Bailey, Broda, Clancy, Conacher, Day, Drillin, Hainsworth, Horner, Jackson, and Primo, and some who had lesser roles: Babe Dye, Sid Howe, Frank Niber, and Carl Voss, the first player signed after the St. Pats became the Maple Leafs, though he got into the Hall as a builder. Fellow builders Bickell, Selke, and Smythe bring the total to 18. 19 if you want to include Foster Hewitt, and 20 if you want to include Dick Irvin, who really got in more as a Blackhawks player and Canadiens coach. Bickell had an award named after him by the Leafs in 1953 to recognize excellence within its own organization. Selke had a trophy named in his honor by the NHL in 1978 for Best Defensive Forward. Smythe also had a trophy named after himself, first handed out to the league's playoffs MVP in 1964. It features a model of the Gardens and a big maple leaf. From 1927 to 1939, thousands of Canadians would have dreamed of playing for Toronto, and in this series we specifically noted the 11 hometown talents lucky enough to do so. But of all the local boys involved, none made an impact more than Conn Smythe himself, a poor kid from a very dysfunctional home not that far from the old Mutual Street Arena, who shaped hockey into what we know today. Yes, every famous name we mentioned throughout all 6 episodes, from Smythe on down, is responsible for the Leafs' truly legendary history, no doubt. However, as we established right at the very beginning, there are no professional teams without paying public. Maybe it's the club's dedicated following, cheering in the stands, listening on the radio, watching on TV, streaming games online, all decked out in blue and white. Maybe it's them who deserve the biggest credit. So, with that in mind, I dedicate this series to the Toronto Maple Leafs faithful, from one fan to another. Thanks for watching, and go Leafs go!